Ellen Stofan, director of the National Air and Space Museum, or I should say the John and Adrienne Mars director of the National Air and Space Museum. Thank you for joining us. I don't know if you've seen this, but I've got the best job in D.C. right now here because I get to talk to all these cool people. But Paul, just to ask you something I think is very important, and I want to remind people that not only are you director of the National Air and Space Museum, but you've been at NASA, you were the chief scientist at NASA, you were responsible for helping to oversee the Curiosity, the Mars rover. And which I keep reminding Curiosity is a female and referred to that way. So he just asked you, what are the most important technologies we can get from our moon efforts right now of returning to the moon that would be applicable in our efforts to get to Mars?
Yeah, there's a couple. It's a great question from Paul, and really, there's a couple main areas, and one of them is all about that journey to Mars. So it's about 7 to 8 months to get to Mars. So the astronauts have to have a place to live, right? And so, what is that transfer vehicle that takes astronauts from the Earth to the moon? What does that look like? It's going to have multiple modules. It's going to have life support systems. It's going to have adequate water. We're actually testing all of those technologies right now on the International Space Station, but we really need to push them to the next level. And NASA is planning to do that in orbit around the moon. Believe it or not, one of the biggest problems they still have on the International Space Station is keeping the toilet working. And we can all agree that an 8-month journey to Mars without a working toilet would be problematic, to say the least. So it's sort of those mundane life support systems that are going to be tested out at the moon, along with a lot of research on human health. There's a lot of concerns you're putting humans out for a long period of time without gravity and in a pretty high radiation field. And so getting the sort of medical, technologies in place, getting the protocols in place for keeping humans safe is going to be tested at the moon before we go to Mars. We're also testing, he mentioned the Perseverance rover, which is now on its way to Mars. There's also technologies being tested on that are helping us get ready to get humans to Mars. That's fascinating. Ellen, you and I were recently talking with the ambassador of the UAE about the UAE sending up a new probe to Mars. And in that, it made me think about, you're director of the National Air and Space Museum. How soon are we going to need an International Air and Space Museum where the contributions and the stakeholding, a lot of this is very national-centric in the United States, at least even our discussion today. But when you look at the international scene, is this becoming a new kind of commons when it comes to space technology and exploration that we didn't have as much before? It really is. And it's funny because obviously the National Air and Space Museum for years has told the story of sort of the competition moving to collaboration between Russia and the United States and the deep involvement of the European Space Agency with the United States. But as we are in the process of renovating our museum on the National Mall and updating all the galleries, we're really looking at how do we tell that story of the fact that there are so many new players. As you said, the UAE has a spacecraft called Hope that's on its way to Mars. There are actually 16 space agencies from around the world working on this roadmap of how do we get humans back to the moon and then on to Mars. So it's really becoming quite international. Lots of different players, and that's great because you need all hands on deck to do tough things like getting humans to Mars. So it's a new story that we're telling, but it's sort of a more complicated and level playing field of the old story.
So one of the conversations I've been trying to have with people, it's a hard one because we don't know what the future is necessarily going to look like, but you've been in this world long enough as a director, planner, and you know so many of the players in there. What are the things that America doesn't have right now that if it did, we would be achieving more in science? We would be hitting some of our targets. What are some of the changes you would make in the process? Maybe this is a very wonky question. I'm always interested in how how a bill becomes a law and how you fund something. But are there ways in which we could improve the system to make the outcomes better on the other end, given your experience?
Yeah, sort of two different areas I'm going to attack that from. And the first is maybe a little bit of the more inside. Our research programs, and not just NASA, but in lots of different agencies, the funding's tight. The number of people proposing to do research gets higher and higher. The more people you have, the more competition you have. You think, oh, more competition would drive out better research. But in essence, what it tends to do is it tends to drive down innovation and drive down creativity. Because as the competition gets harder, you tend to fund the things that are safe, that already look done, that are, get the shiny 5 stars because you're going to get a result. You're not willing to risk. You're not willing to fail. And so as that competition has gotten harder, I really think agencies and the government needs to find a way of how do we really set aside some money to make sure that we're pushing innovation, new thinking, half of which may fail. So you really have to think about this fail fast mentality, even when it comes to research, because frankly, a lot of the research that gets funded tends to be more on the incremental side, not on the big leaps in innovation. So that's one area. The second area is, of course, if you look at the history of science, it's not a level playing field and it's not a meritocracy. It's been heavily dominated by white men. And obviously a lot of great stuff has gotten done. But when you think of all of that talent out there, white women, women of color, men of color, that have not been allowed to contribute at the same levels. They've been there the whole time, they've been contributing, but it's really been underutilized. We're not tapping into the talent of all of our population. If we could jumpstart that, just think what we could accomplish.
So how do you jumpstart it? Because this has come up a lot, and is it exposing young children to science and scientific method and technology in ways that we're not doing now? Is it taking talent out there that is interested in science and that is older and somehow bringing them in? I mean, I'm interested in how to wave a wand and fix this. If that's the secret sauce of success, how do we do it?
The problem is, Steve, and we would have fixed this years ago if it were simple, right?
Yeah.
Because people have been
know.
trying.
Maybe I think there's a bias built in the system, honestly. So I'm not sure we would have before, but I do think attitudes are changing now. So
I think attitudes are changing, and right, that's part of it. But the problem is it's a pipeline problem. So it's a yes all, not a I need to go do this. When you think of the role a place like the Air and Space Museum plays, we're trying to make sure we tell all the stories so that a little girl black girl who comes in, she sees stories about Mae Jemison, about Bessie Coleman. And a Latino girl sees a story about Ellen Ochoa, the first Latina astronaut in space. So are we telling all the stories to inspire all the kids? That's part of it. How do we engage kids? How do we keep them engaged? So as they go from elementary school to middle school, into high school, then into college, and frankly, we know there are problems at each of those levels. There's a lot of research that's been done on this. And so we really need to attack it as a pipeline problem. And then obviously at the college level, the graduate school level, there's been problems with harassment, there's been problems with inclusion that need to be fixed, and those have carried on into the workplace. And so it's not just how do we diversify, but how do we include? Because if we forget that piece, frankly, that's the reason why sometimes the numbers seem to be going up, but you have people leaving the field because they don't feel welcome. We've got to attack it on all fronts. We've got to attack it in a pipeline fashion, but it's fixable, and that's the good news.
Ellen, I'm going to ask you a tough question. The National Air and Space Museum, probably most popular, most visited museum in America. And by Republicans, by Democrats, by people from rural Kansas, where I'm from, and Oklahoma, as New York. That it's something that everyone feels proud of. In this country. Do you have any insights from now being the chief steward of this museum and these interactions of how to get Americans back on the same page regarding big projects, big causes, big purposes?
Steve, it's a great question. And I think that's the one thing about, being at Air and Space, and especially as we've gone through COVID this year, that I've really thought about, because last summer, it seems like about 100 years ago, we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of Apollo. This year, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13. Here's a country that rose to the challenge in 8.5 years from President Kennedy to get humans to walk on the surface of the moon. We did it. Here was Apollo 13 that we thought, for sure, we were going to lose those poor 3 astronauts on their way to the moon. We didn't. We brought them home safely. How did we do it? Innovation, out of the box thinking and teamwork. And to me, what I love about the fact that the Air and Space Museum is the most popular museum in this country is the fact that we tell that story of look what we can achieve as Americans when we put our mind to it. So frankly, that's a reason you're always teasing me about how enthusiastic I am to get humans to Mars. But one of the reasons for that is just think how that could unite our country in common cause, pushing technology forward, real results, real inspiration for the next generation.
Well, I want to say I may tease you about going to Mars, but I'm with you anyway. I'm a big, big supporter of Mars and space, and Ellen Stofan. I want to thank the John and Adrienne Mars, director of the National Air and Space Museum, Ellen Stofan, for spending time with us. As always, I don't think she's ever turned me down. There'll be a time, the law of averages. Ellen, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Steve.